Hello and welcome back to the virtual classroom. I'm your host, Dr. Homestead. As you can see, today's topic is one of kind of my big arguments for this course. And it really begins to set in kind of the way that in which that Anglos in America have socially, culturally, economically constructed Mexicanos in the United States. And that is a designation that I've posited even in my research that they are considered first-class laborers, but second-class citizens. And to me, this is a big thing and a really important topic. And we've done a lot of setup thus far to understand what's going on and kind of setting the base of understanding. But today we really get to delve into this really important concept that Mexicanos are viewed as being elite, the best. We need them, first-class laborers. But at the same time, even though they've been given status as citizens, they are indeed second-class citizens. So this is a big, important lecture that is going to set up a lot of things going forward. But before we begin, as always, take a moment, hit pause on this video, jot down that lecture outline to the right, and pay particular attention to those keywords to your left. Make sure you can identify the who, what, where, when, why, be able to connect them to each other and their larger historical significance. You got it? Let's get started. So as I was saying, the last lecture, vitally important to understand what's going on post Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. And it begins that conversation, what's kind of leading up till today. And again, each lecture will build on the previous lecture, of course, but this one really gets into the meat of the matter. Because what happens is all the events surrounding the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo and the aftermath are vitally important, yes, but they tend to get overshadowed in history. Because as I even said in the last lecture, the number one concern after the Mexican-American War was not really the Mexican inhabitants of the Southwest region. It was, what do you do with the land, and should it be slave territory or free territory? But this lecture, we're going to push past the Civil War. And so, again, the brief, really oversimplified, view of this is, in 1861, Abraham Lincoln is going to become president. Even prior to his inauguration, 7 southern states are going to secede from the Union, and this is going to lead to the Civil War. Now, initially, Lincoln's focus was going to be to, restore the Union. However, within a couple of years, the kind of objective changes slightly and includes the elimination of slavery itself. And so what we need to talk about today now is what's next. So the Civil War takes place from 1861. It's going to end on April 9th, 1865. And there's a lot going on in the country. But for the purposes of this lecture, of this course, I'm going to give a quick, brief overview of all the things that are going on. And then we'll turn back to understanding, okay, so what was life like for Mexicanos? Does that make sense? So the beginning is a little bit of setup, but we're going to get into the meat of it really quickly here. So in the years after the Civil War, the United States is going to enter into a truly revolutionary time in the nation's history. The war is over. Human enslavement has ended, except in the case of imprisonment. But at that same time, the 35 years after the Civil War, the United States is going to experience a massive social, cultural, political, and economic shift. Now, so I'm going to go quickly region by region here to understand what's going on, big picture. So first, in the South, post 1865, the big question is, how do you restore those rebellious Confederate states? Because you have to figure out, do you just, hey, come on back, welcome? Do you punish them for leaving the Union and causing a war? That is witnessed, all told, both sides, more than 625,000 people dead. And this ultimately, this Reconstruction aspect is going to be the primary feature of this lecture. And then when we go on to lecture 6, then we will get into how does this affect the other parts of the country. But for today, the main focus we're going to circle back to is what is life like during this Reconstruction period. But while this is the main focus of this lecture, and the focus is on the South right now, while all of this is going on in the South, while Abraham Lincoln is trying to decide what's next for the South, at the same time, the power economic order, the oligarchy, if you will, of the United States, the rich elites of wealth, that power is being shifted post-Civil War. You see, pre-Civil War, in the antebellum era, the power bastion of political power and wealth is mostly in the South with the large plantation owners, the large enslavers. But in the post-war world, that power is now and wealth is now shifted to the North, especially the Northeast, which is undergoing the Industrial Revolution. New technology like railroads and telegraph, steel, telephone, skyscrapers are beginning to boom. And it's causing a massive industrial and economic growth. That's going to see the rise of corporations and venture capitalists and see a power transition to the Northeast. This transition, though, also causes massive immigration. It causes tremendous growth of inner cities while simultaneously creating a new phenomenon, the first suburbs, as wealthier Anglos begin to leave the cities and use trolley cars and subways to go into work in the cities. But at the same time, we're also experiencing massive westward expansion. Even during the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln had his eye on what's next. And during the Civil War in 1862, they passed the Homestead Act, which encourages westward expansion. And Lincoln knew that this was not going to really do much during the war years, but he was thinking about what was after the war. What is next for the United States when the war is over? And the Homestead Act basically guaranteed, land that was either really, really cheap, pennies on the acre, or if you worked it for 5 years and improved it, which by the way was a very vague, nebulous definition. What does improvement really mean? It was free. And so we start seeing the myth of the Old West. As the war ended in 1865, thousands of Anglos, supposedly cowboys, are going to go out west to ranch, to farm, and to mine. Now, initially, these are going to be small-time ventures, small-time ranches, small mom-and-pop mines, small farming ventures. But that kind of easy money will not last long. Because what they're going to find is in the West, the land is not suitable for farming, except in California. And therefore, it takes massive amounts of money to buy technology, equipment, to irrigate the fields in what is now the kind of Great Plains region. Same with ranching, because ranching is going to involve driving the herd from Texas up into Kansas City, Missouri, and into Kansas to catch the railroad lines to send the meat back east. Well, that land around the railroad to board and house these cattle is expensive, and only the wealthy can afford it. So very quickly, these are going to become, much like we had agribusiness in old plantation system, we're going to have agribusiness in the West with large land-owning farmers, large land-owning ranchers, large land-owning miners, who are the only ones wealthy enough to buy the equipment needed to sustain a productive, lucrative operation. And very quickly in all three of these, whether it's farming, ranching, or mining, big business will take over where only a handful of individuals will own large organizations and corporations. And of course, not only will this run afoul with Native Americans who live in the land, but Anglos will also increasingly need new labor sources for their ventures. Enter Mexicanos. But at the same time as all of this, we also enter in a new phase of U.S. history known as imperialism. Now, officially defined, imperialism just means the policy of expanding a country's influence or power through diplomacy or military force. Let me even add to this economic imperialism. And it starts very slowly in the 1860s with the purchase of Alaska. By the 1880s, we have now taken Hawaii. By 1898, we go to war with Spain in the Spanish-American War, and we will get temporary control of Cuba. We get Guam, the Philippines, Puerto Rico, creating an empire for the United States that stretches well beyond from sea to shining sea. Our manifest destiny now has reached across the ocean. And of course, all of this is going on in the post-Civil War era. So I want you to understand that backdrop. Keep this in mind as we're talking over the next few lectures, that all this stuff is going on. And the thing is, while some of it is kind of, say, big picture stuff like imperialism, it has a direct dramatic influence on everyday people on the ground. Because, for example, when we go into the Philippines, we are going to allow Filipinos to come to the United States freely. And they will work alongside the Mexicanos in the fields of California. Likewise, Puerto Ricans will be allowed to travel freely in the United States to work. They will work alongside and be shipped all over the country and work alongside Mexicanos in the fields. And so these are all vitally important concepts to understand. And each one of these things in a good U.S. history course will spend at least one full hour-and-a-half lecture, if not 2 or 3. In these events, whether it's the Reconstruction era, whether it's westward expansion, whether it's industrialization, which I personally spend 3 lectures on in a regular U.S. history course. Because one just on the technology of Industrial Revolution, one on the immigration aspect of Industrial Revolution. That's just northern immigration, not counting the southward immigration we'll talk about today. And I talk one lecture on just labor. And then on top of all that, you have imperialism, a whole lecture or 2 in and of itself. But again, like I said, today's topic is Reconstruction. And one of the big, of course, and hallmark things about the end of the Civil War is we've finally, thankfully, ended the institution of slavery. We've ended the enslavement of human beings in the United States. And that's big. And so I want to pick up right now in the years right after the Civil War, because one of the big problems, or I shouldn't say problems, but one of the big changes, one of the big issues for the South was a labor issue, an economic issue. Because on the one hand, no more use of enslaved labor, except in the case of imprisonment, which means if you just find a way to imprison people or imprison more people that you don't like, you can then use them as free labor. Talk about that in a minute. But you see, in the post-bellum, post-Civil War era, the United States enters into a history known as Reconstruction. Now, I do want to hit a couple of highlights about the drastic changes that occur in the South during the post-war years. So the Civil War ends in 1865. Very famously, General Robert E. Lee will surrender at Appomattox Courthouse to General Ulysses S. Grant on April 9th, 1865. And now it's time to reconstruct the nation. Now, one of the first most important things that is added just before the war ends is the inclusion of the 13th Amendment. And of course, the 13th Amendment is going to end enslavement of human beings in the United States, except in the case of imprisonment. And again, we'll come back to that later, what that actually means, why I keep saying that over and over. Then we have the 14th Amendment that will guarantee citizenship to formerly enslaved African Americans. And then we'll have the 15th Amendment that guarantees voting rights. Now, it is worth noting that these amendments were specifically written to address formerly enslaved African Americans. This is the purpose of them, was to address their needs. But when you add new laws to our Constitution, it's going to have a dramatic impact beyond just the group it was originally intended for. And even immediately, it's going to be highly impactful of both Mexicans and Mexican Americans. So I'll start with the amendments first. So first, the 13th Amendment. It is added to the Constitution officially in December of 1865 that will outlaw and ban enslavement except in the case of imprisonment. Now, besides the immediate legal impact, it would be significant going forward as immediately the South plantation owners begin to cry labor shortage. Because in their minds, they've been abandoned. And believe me, there are actually quotes in history of former plantation owners saying they can't believe that African Americans left them, deserted them upon getting their freedom. And they begin to cry labor shortage. And so immediately, when I say in the year after, so remember, the 13th Amendment is passed or officially added to the Constitution in December 1865. Even within 1866, within a year, a number of states, including Alabama, Texas, Louisiana, Arkansas, Georgia, Mississippi, Florida, Tennessee, South Carolina, all those old South, deep South states, the Confederate states, they begin to counter the 13th Amendment by invoking that second part of the amendment. No more enslavement, except in the case of imprisonment. And so what they did was begin, as a state-run program, they began to lease convicts to farms. And so what they would do was, you arrest someone, you put them in prison for a crime, and then the state will lease them to a local farm. The farmer does not pay the workers, the laborers, they pay a fee to the state to lease the workers. So the workers get nothing. They are now performing involuntary servitude. But it's considered legal because they are in prison. And yes, it does cost the owner of the farm some money, but they are no longer having to pay for everyday meals and pay for housing. This is now run by the state. And so what they do is it makes the business of arresting Black people very lucrative. And what we see during this era is we will see thousands of Anglos become hired by these states as newly deputized police officers. The occupation as a police officer grows exponentially starting in 1866. Their primary responsibility was to search out and arrest formerly enslaved Black people who were in violation of the so-called Black codes. Again, these Black codes that are being passed that are based on old slave codes. And so, for instance, these things could be you're considered a vagrant who's loitering on someone else's property, or you're not being a productive member of society. They passed laws that said you had to pay a yearly annual fee just so you could have the right to choose where you want to work. If you don't pay that fee, you can be arrested. Now, is this really legal? Of course not. But it was passed at the state level, and therefore they kind of turned a blind eye to it. Now, once arrested, these men, women, and children would be leased to plantations to harvest cotton, tobacco, and sugarcane, or at least to work in the coal mines or railroad companies. And of course, these businesses would then pay the state for every prisoner who worked for them. This is prison labor. And the thing is, these were petty crimes most of the time. For instance, Mississippi would pass what's called the pig law. And basically, anyone who was guilty or found guilty, I should say, not they were actually always guilty, they were found guilty of stealing a farm animal, i.e., a pig, or any other piece of property worth more than $10, would be charged with grand larceny and sentenced to 5 years in prison, which means 5 years of hard labor being leased out to work on a farm or a mine or so forth. And theoretically, these laws would apply to everyone. They're written, they don't say this law only applies to Black people. But they were selectively enforced by these newly deputized police officers. And the selective enforcement disproportionately targeted mostly young, poor African Americans. But even this, as we'll see in a minute, will not fully make up for the so-called lost labor of enslaved Blacks. Meanwhile, at the federal level, Congress, Reconstructionists in Congress, are trying to deal with the situation, are trying to combat these Black codes. And on July 9th, 1868, they will ratify officially the 14th Amendment, which provides a dramatic expansion, broad definition of American citizenship. And again, this is the first major change in citizenship since 1790, with that famous 1790 Immigration Act that said free white person. Let's read what it says here. It says, all persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof, live under the laws, they are citizens of the United States in the state wherein they reside. I want to repeat this again. This is important. Now, remember, number one, this does not include women. Women were not able to have their own citizenship at this point. At this point in history, when a woman gets married, their citizenship is tied to that other husband. But let me read this again. All persons, and again, it originally was men, born or naturalized in the United States are citizens of the United States. Now, of course, this is being written to deal with these formerly enslaved African Americans. The idea was, remember, up until 1868, based on 1790 law, only free white people could become citizens. So in order to overturn and fix this, the federal government passed the 14th Amendment that says all persons, all males. And it goes on then to point out that nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, property. How does that impact Mexican Americans now in the Southwest? No state shall deprive any person of life, liberty, property without due process of law, nor deny any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. Again, this is being written explicitly to deal with those Black codes. The pig law, for instance. It's being selectively enforced, but how is that equal protection then? How is having separate schools equal protection? This is known as the Equal Protection Clause. This is going to be vitally important going forward. And we'll refer back to this Equal Protection Clause a lot. But I want to focus right now on the top part of that, the beginning. All persons born or naturalized. Again, this was being written to deal with the formerly enslaved African Americans. But think of the implication going forward. Well, we've already said all Mexicans are white based on the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. But think about this from the perspective of there's still a current debate regarding the 14th Amendment. Again, it's not much of a debate, really. It's been settled by the Supreme Court, but it's been in the news in the last 5 years. In fact, prominent politicians have brought it up, saying it's been misinterpreted over the years, recently. And what this means broadly, though, is for immigrants. If an immigrant is in the United States as an undocumented immigrant, and they have a child in the United States. The 14th Amendment says all persons born in the United States are citizens. So it puts to rest this idea of the children of undocumented immigrants born in the United States. They are not, a horrible term, I hate to say it out loud, but anchor babies. They're not anchor babies. They're citizens. They are citizens of the United States by virtue of their birth. That issue is settled. Supreme Court has determined this to be true, and it's directly written in the 14th Amendment. This is usually where in a face-to-face class, we kind of have a discussion about this. But just, I want to really, that is a settled issue, and it's not up for debate. And again, back to the topic at hand, this amendment is being passed in response to these black codes. Because what the idea of the 14th Amendment does, it takes the power away from the states to enforce equal protection of the laws of citizenship. It theoretically puts control or authority to define citizenship, not at the state level, but at the federal level. It is the federal government's job to enforce this. Because otherwise, African Americans were going to be put into this quasi-slavery type of situation, such as a convict leasing system. But again, the passage was concerned with the formerly enslaved African Americans, but it'll have a tremendous impact on other groups, other immigrant groups, especially Mexicanos. But when taken together with elimination of enslavement, it causes so-called labor shortage. Congress would also pass the 15th Amendment, 1870, that guarantees the right to vote. The right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or any state on the account of race, color, previous condition of servitude. Again, this is something that's been under attack and been in the news in the last, few years. This is being under attack because what does this mean? Again, this was originally written to allow voting rights for the newly citizenship, formerly enslaved African Americans. You can't deny the right to vote. But as we're going to see, that's what's going to happen. And once again, this theoretically took the power, guaranteed the right to vote away from the states, and put it at the federal level. And again, this is males only, no females allowed. These are all hugely important things. And again, theoretically, these Reconstruction Acts, the 13th, the 14th, the 15th Amendment, were all a big change, whereas now the federal government guaranteeing these rights, the rights to citizenship, the rights to vote, versus the states. Now, to enforce this in the newly reconstructed South, the U.S. government under Abraham Lincoln and his successors through Congress, they had divided the South into 5 military districts. Now, this was not martial law. This was simply military on hand to ensure that these amendments, these laws were being followed. Because, again, this is in response to the beefing up of police forces with these newly deputized people, whites, trying to basically essentially re-enslave African Americans by arresting them. Unfortunately, in 1877, Reconstruction ends. The federal government removes federal troops from the South. And that equal protection of citizenship and voting gets kind of turned back over to the states. Now, again, the federal government had the jurisdiction here. But by removing the troops, the federal government turned a blind eye. And what rises is what we call in history the New South. That is going to deal with the so-called labor problem in a old, new way. because theoretically the 13th and 14th Amendment leveled the playing field, not only for newly freed, formerly enslaved blacks, but guaranteeing equal protection under law. But that was not how Southern farmers saw it. Instead, they cried labor shortage. Now, part of this was addressed by the convict leasing system, but they still said they needed more workers. And they can't arrest everyone, so they did. And so they started turning to immigrant work, especially in the West. But after 1882, the United States passed the Chinese Exclusion Act. Now, officially, it was enacted in 1882. It would be renewed in 1892. It would be renewed in 1902, and it would become permanent. And so by 1882, we have now banned Chinese immigrants. In 1907, we also banned Japanese immigrants. Now, it's theoretically not called the Japanese Exclusion Act. It's called the Gentleman's Agreement, because Japan was a rising technology, military power. And to allow them to save face, we told them basically, you prevent immigration to the United States. If you don't, we will ban it. So it was an unofficial ban, but it was banned. And so again, more laborers are needed because there's now a labor shortage in that formerly enslaved African Americans are no longer being forced to work on the plantations. We have a rising industrialization in the Northeast. We have mining going on in the Southwest and West. We have the gold rush still going on in California. And we've also lost some forced laborers in the South. We've banned both Japanese and Chinese. And so, yes, there is a labor shortage. But what this did was create a whole new labor system in farming. It's called sharecropping. And this is something that will impact heavily African Americans, but especially here in Texas, it's going to heavily impact Mexican and Mexican Americans. And because the South is largely agricultural, very few Southerners were able to afford their own land post-Civil War. And so it was still, land was being held by these formerly rich plantation owners. And so these poor farmers, white, black, and brown, they can't afford to buy land to grow their own crops. What they did then was they would rent land from a landlord. So the former plantation owner now becomes a landlord. And they become tenant farmers, or they lease a part of the land, or more commonly was sharecropper. Now, sharecropping was basically, here's the deal. You're a family unit. You work a piece of land on a landlord's land, and in return, the landlord gets a share of the crop that's produced on it. So on this plot of land that you were given to work, you have to grow food for your family, but you have to grow a large percentage of the main staple crop, usually cotton in this case, that will be given to the landlord for payment. And you need to grow some more cotton for yourself to sell so you can make money to buy other things you need. In many ways, this becomes a pseudo-quasi type of enslavement because it was difficult for poor whites, Mexicanos, and African Americans to purchase land due to lack of money and rampant discrimination in the South. So they worked the land in exchange for giving the landowner a share. The problem is it creates a cycle of debt that is going to spread across the entire Southwest. And this is going to become the predominant form of labor from the 1860s all the way through World War II in the 1940s. For 80 years, this becomes the dominant form of labor in the South. The issue with sharecropping, though, is it creates a cycle of debt because initially these farming families have no money to purchase tools, to purchase seed, to purchase farm equipment. And they would have to borrow either the items or money from the landowner with the promise of repaying that debt at the end of the year with crops when they sell the crops. However, the land did not produce as much as it had previously. Because number one, less labor is working it. Number two, this is old, used land. And number three, the owners of the land did not give these sharecroppers the best land, the most fertile land. They gave them the worst land. And thus, when the crop yields were less than expected at the end of the year, these sharecroppers had to give, that certain amount to the landowner. There was not enough left to sell to repay the debt from the start of the year. And then that same process would repeat for the following year. They'd have to borrow again from the landowner. And because the landowners aren't paying in money, they're paying in, crop shares. These poor whites, poor African Americans, poor Mexicanos are being caught in the cycle of debt, which is slavery by another name. And yet, despite the sharecropping system, despite the convict leasing system, Southerners still cried foul. They said, we have a labor shortage. And so this entire system, whether it was growing tobacco, whether it was growing cotton, whether it was growing sugar cane, or whatever else they wanted to grow, citrus in the West, it was all being shored up by immigrant labor. And in the South, it was being shored up by seasonal migrant laborers who would travel daily, seasonally, yearly in from Mexico into Texas, and then go across Texas, through Arizona and New Mexico, into California, up California, and then come back down, all the time working and traveling with the harvest season. And you have to realize, in the post-1865, post-Civil War years, the southern border is open. There are no real checkpoints. There's no immigration and naturalization services. There's no border patrol yet, other than some Texas Rangers we'll talk about later. There's no immigration stations. Now, in the Northeast, there were these things. There was, as you see on the screen, Ellis Island. It was screening for the dreaded, hated Eastern European people. In the West, there was Angel Island to filter out Asians from China and Japan. But in the Southwest, there's no port of entry, really. There's big cities like El Paso, but there are no real station port of entry that says you must go through this line to enter the United States. It's an open desert across Arizona, New Mexico, California. In Texas, you just cross the river. No one cared. There's no real port of entry. Instead, hundreds, sometimes thousands of Mexicans daily would just cross into the border into the United States. They would do a job and then leave that night. Like their job was just the next city over, but it happened to be the United States. Or they would cross in, they would perform migrant labor in the fields and in the mines, on the ranches. And then they would stay for a season. They might travel to another farm or ranch or mine in the state of Texas, or travel across multi-states, and then go back at the end of the harvest season. And again, we'll talk more about this migrant labor pattern in future lectures, but this is a porous border. This is a situation in which there was no real restrictions. And again, no one cares your actual citizenship status of Mexican versus Mexican American here. This is just laborers filling positions. No one is crying, they're taking our jobs. These are filling positions that are needed laborers. Now, yes, is this being exploited? Yes. But as we're going to see, they were exploiting the Northeast as well in the industries. There are no minimum wage rules. There are no safety standards yet. This is essentially the Wild West. It's a free-for-all. But this porous open border, combined with the legacy of Reconstruction, are going to cause other issues as well, including rampant discrimination. But we'll talk about that in the second half of our lecture. So for now, until then, take care and bye-bye.